Like most developers out there, Creative Assembly has its share of ups and downs, of miracle tier accomplishments and Dante's Inferno level crimes. For every developer action there's an equal and opposite community reaction, however cheesy that sounds, and it's also a completely wrong statement. Developers and publishers have for the past 10 years or more gotten away with a lot of practices that arguably would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. These include games that feel more and more like the last one, games that ship with game-breaking or at least frustrating bugs that may or may not ever be fixed, and an onslaught of extra purchasable content in the form of DLC, downloadable content that sometimes expand the game in ways that adds more flash over substance. Not every developer is guilty of this, but many are. The answer to who's to blame is manifold and not easily answered either, but I think we can begin to discuss it if we talk about it in a tiered system. But first, if you watch my videos and enjoy them and are not yet subscribed, please consider doing so. I put a lot of time and effort into these videos, and your engagement really helps me reach more people and helps the channel out. If you want to help out even more, I would be grateful if you consider supporting me on Patreon, as a YouTube member, or through Super Thanks, which really helps the channel stay up and allows me to work on content like this and beyond. Thank you so much. At the top of the blame game ladder, we have the publishers and the executives, companies and people that are often beholden to shareholders who likely do their best to make the most amount of money for the least amount of effort. What matters to them is good enough, not above and beyond. The second tier are the developers, the people who actually make our games. This is where the passion and talent lies, but developers must of course work on the schedule set by the publisher, and since developers are often owned or funded by publishers, the effort put into the games are also often in part determined by the amount of funding and time given. Developers must not only sell their games to the public then, but first and foremost often make a case to the publishers, who determine whether it's even worth funding and if they'll see a large return on investment. Video games is a business after all, and even though passion is what once began the idea of a game, some of that passion and love is likely to be mired in business and cost-effective measures along the way. The third and final tier is the consumer, the player base, who either accepts or denies the premise laid out by the developer in the form of a game and its mechanics and polish, or the publisher in the forms of trailers and marketing. The consumer is the final arbiter here, and while a regular developer might survive one or two denials from the consumer, enough bad sales and responses might end a studio faster than you think, and make publishers close down studios entirely. And while this system is the basis for capitalism and sounds like a fairly democratic way of determining what's good or bad, it's not that easy. As with any large group, it's almost impossible to coordinate a strong response to anything. In the case of gaming controversy, as we're seeing with Creative Assembly and the Shadows of Change DLC right now, chances are the vast majority of Total War players don't even know what's going on and haven't the faintest idea about a controversy. Perhaps the clearest way to create a response these days is the Steam review system, however, and despite Reddit being filled with anti-CA rhetoric, Steam, where games are actually bought, is visible to anyone who wants to play Total War. And while the merits of review bombing can be debated, a strong argument is that Steam reviews are not meant to be actual reviews, but recommendations. And in this way, people can like a game, but recommend not to buy it because of various aspects. In Total War and Warhammer 3's case, the recent DLC controversy. I've gone through the current events in recent videos, but I wanted to dig a bit deeper and not really touch on the most recent controversy, because that's just the tail end of things. You see, once upon a time, things were a bit different, and I'm not talking about 6 years ago when the first Warhammer game came out, and even though I won't pretend to have been there since the beginning, I've been here since Total War really popped off for real. Rome Total War. So if Rome missed important things from Shogun or Medieval 1, then feel free to let me know in the comments. This video will deal with campaigns in Total War, and mostly how they have evolved, changed, and not really all for the better, and why this is. When speaking about passion and love for the game, Rome Total War had everything, and Creative Assembly managed with this game, I believe, to realize its dream. A full 3D Total War with groundbreaking visuals that combine that massive campaign with fully realized and realistic looking battles. Back in 2004, there was nothing like this, and for all intents and purposes, there still isn't. I'm mentioning these basics because back then, these weren't just basics. Total War was revolutionary and inspiring. The combined campaign and battle features were the main course and selling points, but underneath lied so much more. Despite taking a few shortcuts on the surface, like with historical accuracy, Creative Assembly's passion shined in the capabilities of this campaign, much more so than other popular strategy games at the time, regardless of genre, like Civilization or Age of Empires. Total War had actual depth to its campaign that wasn't based on simple numbers going up or flashy mechanics being unlocked after clicking the right buttons. Rome was about managing your empire, and the battles, while awesome, was actually just a simple extension of empire management. Think about it. You can play custom battles, sure, but if you want to play the campaign, which Total War was made for, you wouldn't be able to skip the campaign, but you can skip the battles. The fun part is of course that the campaign itself is fun enough on its own, as you can actually manage populations, trade, the approval of the Senate and the people of Rome, relations with other factions, taxes, and so on. And Rome did all this because in a huge way, Total War was a historical simulator. Want to roleplay as a Roman Empire? Well, here's what the Roman Empire had to deal with in real life. And even though it's of course not all there, and very simplified, Rome offered enough to keep that illusion and the sense of managing and expanding Roman civilization in most of its facets. Rome Total War was made with this sense of immersion in mind, and you can tell that the people who made it valued giving agency to the player by having them being able to choose what to build where, how to manage your units, where to place your capital, being able to trade regions, manage and move your population around, simulating actual diplomatic range by needing you to have a diplomat physically interact with foreign peoples, giving generals traits based on their actions, allowing you to field as many armies as your economy managed to sustain, offering a family tree that even allowed you to change your faction heir, changing the very face of the map by laying down dirt roads and stone roads, and even forts and watchtowers. I see these aspects as fundamentals to the Rome Total War experience, and this in my opinion is what makes Rome Remastered fun to play all these years later, exactly because even though the visuals might have aged somewhat, the gameplay is still there. And that isn't even mentioning the immersion fluff, like a beautiful building UI that showed you exactly what you were building, bridging the campaign and the cities down below, general speeches and how what they say is determined by their own track record and who they are fighting against, being able to view your own cities in peacetime and marvel at your civic accomplishments, the fact that battles actually took place in a similar geographical location as where the armies met on the campaign map, the fact that the campaign featured actual wonders with meaningful effects for the occupying faction, and which when conquered played an awesome video, and of course that music, that soundtrack that forever cemented Rome as a masterpiece and as a nostalgic diamond. But we mustn't forget things like sound design as well. Listen to how it sounds when I open the building menu, and how it immerses you into the scenery of construction, or the recruitment UI doing the same. Or the powerful and mighty sound of choosing to attack an enemy army or city that really sticks with you.
Engage the enemy!
There's something truly special about arrows and javelins in Rome that just ooze being a part of the battle that's never been replicated, and the same goes for the sounds when cavalry run down fleeing enemies. And just look at how a Roman legion actually forms a testudo, combining thoughtful animations with realistic sound effects. So much of why a game leaves a mark or stays with you for longer than it might have otherwise done comes down to details just like these, and Rome is a prime example of how the details on top of the fundamentals is in the end what creates the masterpiece. What's crazy is that Rome Remastered was arguably made even better with the Barbarian invasion expansion, where we not only got a religious dynamic to everything, not just your cities, but also your generals, and the amazing thing was that while your faction leader's religion ultimately determined the state religion, individual individual cities could function just fine if the appropriate temples or churches existed locally and the governor of the right persuasion was present, meaning you had de facto intra-religious conflict in a much more real way than in Medieval 2 and onwards, where your faction was united religiously, but your population itself could vary in terms of overall religious allegiance percentage. This religious system in turn affects public order and the general traits, but Barbarian invasion also introduced horde armies that didn't even require cities to stay alive, making for dangerous and agile factions. These are mechanics that together arguably makes Rome Total War the most complex and detailed Total War game of all time, and it all happened in 2004 and 2005, almost 20 years ago. Creative Assembly made a masterpiece for the ages with Rome, and I believe anyone who played Rome back in the day will agree that it set the stage for future expectations for what the series would become. In this respect, Medieval 2 wasn't an objective step forward. It kept the population mechanic, but cut the ability to move populations around by disbanding your armies. It ironically removed intra-faction religious conflict in a game that's all about religious warfare. It cut the ability to select a faction heir and viewing your cities in peacetime, and it didn't really go any deeper in many of its shared fundamental mechanics with Rome. But it did add many of its own, like the amazing upgrade mechanic, where soldiers would visibly change their armor if you outfitted them with better equipment. Medieval 2 also added the resource system, which adds a new layer of complexity to the economic system, but it's not really a game changer, and it added the time-appropriate prisoner and ransom system, allowing us to be nice to an enemy army or cut it down to size no matter what. It also introduced princesses as both a layer of diplomacy and dynastic role-playing, allowed us to build cities or castles which prioritized either the economy or the military, and it implemented the amazing system of videos playing when meaningful events occurred, from grand royal marriages to crusades and regular spy missions, which gave all of them so much added joy. Perhaps the mechanic that most gave Medieval 2 its sense of dynamism were the simulated changing of the eras, the fact that the campaign featured cinematic introductions of the Black Plague, the Mongol invasion, gunpowder, and even the discovery of the Americas, a whole new continent that only the most technologically superior factions could even reach because they required high-tech ships. These are meaningful additions and give Medieval 2 so much that you can to some extent excuse what was left behind. The most important surface upgrade in Medieval 2 were the graphics bar none, and even though that really does make a difference all these years later, in terms of gameplay mechanics, Rome just might be the better and the most innovative and revolutionary game. Of course, it ironically wasn't the Creative Assembly main studio that made Medieval 2, which perhaps became their most iconic title. No, it was a smaller studio in Australia who did that, probably while the main CA studio was working on Empire. In this way, it makes sense that Medieval 2 wasn't some radical departure from Rome, and despite missing features from that game, credit should be given where it's due, and Medieval 2 was given a profile and charm of its own because of the mechanics added and all of the ones retained. But a certain pattern does become clear with Medieval 2, the fact that features were only brought forward from Rome if they were integral to the gameplay experience, not because they were good in and of themselves. More than what's already been mentioned, Medieval 2 completely lacks wonders, for example, and the fact that Medieval 2 lacks so much depth and historical flavor, some of which have later been rectified by mods, like dynastic belonging, governorships, and flavor ancillaries, personal religion contra state religion, playable horde factions, and quite literally any real historical buildings at all, is disappointing. But by the time Empire rolls around, it's clear that priorities have completely changed at Creative Assembly, and Empire, while only the beginning and in and of itself not a bad game, hints at the direction Total War would ultimately take. While it is true that Empire retains the Total War soul and introduces revolutionary concepts on its own, it does for example have a population mechanic, and a meaningful one at that, seeing as it expands the very real and innovative settlement system, where towns appear on the map over time as their population grows, and Empire's trade system is perhaps the best in the series, with not only regular trade happening, but the need to secure resources overseas with actual navies, and then having to defend your trade lanes from pirates and foreign privateers. And Empire still even offers cinematics when, for example, having gentlemen duel each other, and funnily enough, brings forward Medieval 2's separation between civilian and military settlements. Empire does away with a lot of the other detail that made Total War what it was. It lost meaningful and all family member dynamics, events with any consequences despite often featuring references to historical occurrences, any real historical mechanics really, but most of all, Empire changed the way Total War worked. While army management luckily remained the same, Empire neutered player agency when it came to actual Empire management where it matters most, infrastructure and buildings, and it's been to the detriment of the series ever since. For some reason, at some point, someone at Creative Assembly thought it would be a good idea to take player choice and sense of roleplay away and replace it with a simplified and outright dumbed-down version of the past. Instead of it being up to you to decide what to build where, and having you being able to select from the entire building roster, you now have just a few slots to fill, and very few buildings to choose from, meaning cities were never the same again. While there are many good things to say about Empire, like the fact that the research system, while arguably not a good thing, was actually as good as they come because the different innovations actually unlocked new buildings or real new ways of waging war, from using bayonets to standardized lines of fire, this gamification, or the more popular term, streamlined game design, which affected everything from infrastructure to diplomacy, which now can be conducted with whoever, whenever, and wherever you wanted, would in turn completely change Total War from being about the details and the individual immersive mechanics that together created a much better whole and a game with soul, to games that, while still offering things no other games do in the same way, have become much more straightforward and simple. I like to think that Empire's way of doing Total War lasted until Rome 2, but things changed already with Shogun 2 just 2 years later. The interesting thing about Shogun 2 is that it ironically went back in time in a good way, but mostly did so only in part. It was a small correction when Shogun 2 offered more buildings per tile rather than the full player choice, and when it continued to offer a research tree, but sadly one that was more based in small incremental changes than Empire's new unlocks, or Medieval 2's and Rome's much more organic upgrades over time. Shogun 2 retained Empire's towns dotting the map, but removed the population system and the ability for new cities to pop up over time, and ever since Shogun 2, population itself never really returned to the series. There's so much I'm not mentioning here, but if the mechanics were in Rome 1, and I specifically mentioned them before, assume they've in fact not made it into Shogun 2, even though certain aspects like general speeches and some cool sound design actually did, and the family tree is arguably better than ever. That's not to say that Shogun 2 isn't a great game either. It has a lot going for it, reintroduced certain aspects, and is perhaps best summed up by being a perfect blend of Medieval 2 and the Empire when it comes to surface mechanics, while still missing out on a lot of the little details mentioned earlier. Shogun 2 was arguably as good as this new version of Total War got, give or take a few mechanics that even Empire did better. So far, it's possible to say that Total War's soul remained, and I say this because of how the games worked. Removing the complete freedom of buildings was a big blunder, and things like missing the ability to change your capital and missing population systems also diminished the experience. But at least in overall terms, like the focus on player choice in terms of army management, and that you could only do as much as your resources enabled, still held true. And the same goes for the battle map, which I've not really talked about all that much since this video is more about the campaigns, but where units still felt like they had weight to them. For many players, Shogun 2 was perhaps the last true Total War title in the Golden Age sense, but Creative Assembly had already lost a lot of respect from many in this player base with Empire, not just for its radical departure and loss of features, but because of two distinct failures. First, the state Empire released in. Empire was buggy, performed badly, and certain features like sieges were just downright bad and boring. Not at all like Medieval 2, where sieges were arguably the best part. The fact that Napoleon essentially patched up and fixed all of Empire's surface issues just a year later showed how rushed Empire had been, despite being the series' new flagship title and the game representing a whole new era for the series. But Empire's release was not just a singular occurrence, but in fact pretty much spelled how major Total War titles would ship from now on, with a few exceptions. And the perhaps worst one of them all was Rome 2, another major stepping stone in the franchise for better or worse. It shipped like a train wreck and took a lot of time not just to be patched up, but it lacked so many mechanics that it only truly turned into a functional Total War game in 2018, when Creative Assembly, led by none other than CA Sofia, picked the game back up and actually began adding new features to it. Of course, Total War Attila experienced horrible bugs and bad performance as well, and despite fixing Rome 2, Attila, the much better game, never received the same treatment. And lastly, Warhammer 3 launched in an incomplete state, with many players reporting numerous bugs not just at launch, but bugs introduced with new DLC that were never really fixed. The second point is arguably even more detrimental to the series than broken releases that may or may not have been fixed, namely modding ability and opening the game up to its community. Prior to Empire, the Total War community had flourished in part due to the amazing and vast mods created by passionate players. They were able to change so many aspects of both Rome and Medieval 2 that overhaul mods became almost a necessity if you wanted much deeper experiences than originally offered. And of course, more than just new experiences, these mods, which offered not just new units and factions, but all new maps, events, and flavor, made us love those games even more because it showcased what was possible and how CA trusted the community community with deepening their games, and in turn received the love of said community. Sure, certain things were indeed hard-coded and could not be changed, but those aspects were more like roadblocks than actual detriments to the experience. With Empire, Total War modding immediately became much more basic, and all modders could realistically achieve were changes that in no way could completely overhaul the experience. There are no mods that expands the map for Empire or Napoleon, no mods that fully change or expand those games. And while there are certainly some great mods for Empire, they never came close to the grand mods for Rome and Medieval 2, which essentially gave us completely new campaigns and experiences altogether. These two factors, regardless of game settings or the removal or changing of game mechanics, are the two by far biggest setbacks to the Total War series, and the two most abject anti-consumer developments by the company. Only now, 8 years after the release of Attila, have modders somehow finally managed to crack the code to CA's campaign map tools, but the public have even yet to see what this truly means for new campaign experiences in Attila and Rome 2. And when compared to Medieval 2, where new campaign maps were made almost instantly, it's a massive setback, especially for a game like Napoleon, a game that could have become the true definition of a globe-spanning and polished empire-building game if the map could be expanded. Returning to Rome 2, and we find ourselves not only in an era where Total War games are often shipped in clearly unfinished states, but one where the conversion from immersive games to fully streamlined and simplified ones is complete. The major and defining role-playing elements of the Golden Age Total Wars are for all intents and purposes completely gone now, replaced by a standardized system that more than anything values restricting the player rather than giving them options. Instead of your actual resources being the limiting factor of your campaign, Total War now has army limits, edict limits, navy limits, agent limits, and building limits. In other words, it's not the game's built-in mechanics that organically limit you anymore, but the game itself putting handcuffs on you. Whether in Rome 2 or Warhammer 3, this remains the case. In other words, while the skeleton of Total War remains, and of course the series still offers its signature battles, which without Total War would objectively not be Total War anymore, this is why and how Total War lost a part of its soul. The part that not only made these games good, but truly legendary. Now, I am a historical Total War player first, but honestly, I wouldn't have to be. The thing is, in their core mechanics, Rome 2 and Warhammer 3 play extremely similarly, and by that, I mean that the core experience is just as shallow when compared to the game spanning Rome to Shogun 2. I prefer Rome 2 to Warhammer 3 because of the historical background of the former, but in all honesty, it didn't have to be that way. The Warhammer series adds some very cool and unique mechanics that are inherent to each faction in the game, and this helps to not only set them apart from each other, but also adds a completely new layer of depth to the game, a layer which frankly no Total War games prior could hope to match in the same way. But the issue is that this new layer, which can consist of several factors, like in the Empire's case, both prestige, imperial authority, and the elector count system, doesn't come on top of a foundation that stands on its own. The foundation is the same stripped down version of Total War that began with Empire, but reached its zenith and worst state in Rome 2, and therefore, managing your empire is nothing like the management of Rome or Medieval 2. To me, this, despite arguably being truly innovative games that have shown how creative assembly has the ability to innovate and take the series further, is why the Warhammer games just aren't as fun as older Total War games, and why they don't draw me in the same way. There are of course exceptions to this rule, but only within the new standardized and simplified paradigm. Total War Attila managed to be a fresh Total War experience with the new system, not because of what it changed from Rome 2, but because of what it added. Family tree, army loyalty, fertility, horde mechanics, a better building UI, actual religious mechanics that were different, but on par with those of Barbarian Invasion, and more. Attila became infinitely more enjoyable than Rome 2 because of this, but of course CA messed it up by leaving it a performatively broken mess, one that never runs decently on any hardware. Please just fix Attila, CA, come on. Another exception is Total War 3 Kingdoms, where CA managed to implement the best diplomacy system in Total War history, but somehow managed to never use it again. And this is an important point which has been a red thread in this entire video. The fact that Creative Assembly is fully capable of striking gold and doing so repeatedly, but never or rarely bringing that gold forward. With every Total War game, instead of completely building on the last one, making each game objectively deeper and more content content filled with ever more complexity, it seems Creative Assembly is self-bound to begin empty-handed, needing to be able to strike gold with every new game for it to actually succeed. The gold in Warhammer 3 are of course the unique faction mechanics, but they didn't manage to bring in Rome Total War's campaign fundamentals to make it an objectively amazing and deeper experience all on its own. Attila managed to implement actual governors and a region-based fertility system, but these mechanics were never really applied to later Total War games and were for some reason never retrofitted back into Rome 2, where these mechanics are just as important and would enhance that Rome 2 experience even further. And even though, again, Three Kingdoms revolutionized Total War diplomacy, Warhammer 3 nor Troy implemented a similar system, opting only for a much more math-based diplomacy system rather than the more vague system from Rome 2 and back. In Troy, Creative Assembly Sofia struck their gold when they chose to base their economic system off of resources instead of just money, lending a new depth to the economic gameplay. Thankfully, CE Sofia is implementing this system also in Total War Pharaoh, which I think is great, but I hope the system is taken even further, and that CA takes the hint here and implements an at least partial resource-based system in their other games, where resources might be required for recruiting certain soldiers or constructing certain buildings, in addition to the regular monetary system. Like any series, Total War games evolve over time, and so does its developer, Creative Assembly. I love what this series used to be, and even though I still find the games decent, it's ultimately the earlier games that I truly love, and many of the later games are only really made playable with mods, like DEI for Rome 2. I still have so much respect for Creative Assembly, but it's sad and frustrating to slowly realize that the company and its developers' vision for this series do not really align with mine anymore. And that phrase is harder to say than you might think, because you never want to realize or admit that things are not the same anymore, even though you have perhaps said it or felt it countless times before. But the worst part of this feeling is perhaps the sense of being tricked, of having loved a series that so perfectly offered a core experience, continued to do so, and then somehow changed course and removed and changed features to the point where what you loved the most is gone. It's still incomprehensible to me the management depth of Total Wars of old just never re-emerged, that population has never returned, that resources has never become important except for a few chosen aspects, and that the series, at least in the past 7 years, struggles with the simple concept of role-playing and player agency, two aspects which were so integral to the Total Wars of old. It also boggles my mind that while Total War games have been simplified in the core experience, for a reason I don't understand, Paradox games continue to be incredibly deep, while keeping massive audiences and amazing player retention over years and years, and importantly, keeping things historical in the process, not relying on a massively popular fantasy IP. And this becomes the last nail in the coffin of CA's sins, namely that it has failed to deliver games that its core audience, the people that were there for 2/3 of the company's lifetime, have been asking for many years. Despite all of this, I have hopes for Total War's future. With the end of Warhammer, it seems CA is forced to focus its efforts elsewhere, and if Total War has no other fantasy setting to go to, it seems history is where the series will shift its efforts once more. But for the series to thrive, it would be naive to think that the setting is everything. After all, the core historical audience of old is arguably the audience that rejects Rome 2 the most, and as such, it becomes vital that Creative Assembly listens to what its historical audience have been begging for ever since Empire came to be, namely the return of the soul of the series, of gameplay enabling roleplay and agency. As of now, I have no idea what the main CA team is up to. Perhaps they're making 3K2, perhaps they're making Medieval 3, or something different entirely. But what I do know is that CA Sofia, despite being limited by the Total War paradigm post-Rome 2, made a great game with the Total War Saga Troy, and now working on Pharaoh, has the opportunity to cement their space in the company. But Pharaoh is up against it, offering a setting only a small minority of Total War fans wanted, and looking a lot like their last game Troy, which suffered from cognitive dissonance largely thanks to the Warhammer games, have stacked much of the player base against anything that reminds them of either Troy or Warhammer. But CA Sofia has shown an ability to change and adapt. And while I not only believe that the Mythos DLC for Troy made it the best it could be under current circumstances, Sofia shows that they've even changed various parts of pre-release Pharaoh, namely importing important UI elements like unicards and banners, vital aspects of immersion, charm, and personality. And while Pharaoh is not my favorite setting either, I'm excited to see how it turns out, and what CA Sofia can do to accommodate the player base who, hopefully, will see this game for what it is and be honest about what they like and dislike. And hopefully, Sofia doesn't actually just listen, but also responds and changes. In the end though, the tragedy of Total War series is that its games have never, or at least rarely, truly been objective improvements over the last game, in a genre where this is very possible to accomplish, because the data and fundamentals from the prior games already exist. Rome 2 could have been an objectively better game than Rome, but it failed miserably, for example, despite taking place in the exact same setting where no core change was needed. At the same time, Creative Assembly has for all intents and purposes failed to listen and to communicate with its core player base, an extremely dedicated group of people who've been with the series for literal decades and who wish nothing but the best for the series they love. With time, however, the Total War series has only grown and brought in a sea of new players, and at the same time, the games rely more and more on piecemeal DLC drops than games that ship with most of the bells and whistles they have at the end of their lifetime. And while this can be an okay thing, it's only good insofar as the base game is amazing on its own. The recent DLC controversy comes at the end of a long line of DLC drops from CA for both Warhammer 3 and Warhammer 2, two games which have been immensely popular among new players, and surely made an unbelievable amount of money for Creative Assembly. But sales do not necessarily correspond with quality, and the problem here is that because CA is the only company making these games, even people who do not necessarily enjoy the latest games, at least as much as the previous ones, are likely to buy them, simply because there is no competition. In one way or another, this has allowed CA, perhaps erroneously, to believe that people actually think their games are better than ever, or that they at the very least can get away with making games the way they have been doing for a decade or more. And I say get away with, because while publisher executives are sure to put this squeeze on a developer when it can, consumers and players are difficult to manage and are likely to purchase content for game series they have a relationship with. Without a proper response like the one we've seen recently, change is unlikely to happen, but with these recent events, it's going to be interesting to see how CA will respond, not just in the short term, but if we'll finally see some long-term changes here. It should be obvious by now that Total War is one of my favorite game series, but it hasn't been the same in many years, and while mods have given games like Rome 2 and Attila a massive leg up, we need the base games to offer those incredible fundamentals they used to do all those years ago. But what do you think? Has Total War never been better, or has CA failed to take inspiration and advantage of the lessons and mechanics that made this series so great and popular in the first place? Let me know in the comments, and remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!